The Duel, Part 5, in a set of 6, by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. The Duel, Part 5. The delicate attention of his adoring sister had secured for the General perfect liberty of movement in the house where he was a guest. He had even his own entrance through a small door in one corner of the orangery. Thus he was not exposed that evening to the necessity of dissembling his agitation before the calm ignorance of the other inmates. He was glad of it. It seemed to him that if he had to open his lips he would break out into horrible and aimless imprecations, start breaking furniture, smashing china and glass. From the moment he opened the private door, and while ascending the 28 steps of a winding staircase giving access to the corridor on which his room opened, he went through a horrible and humiliating scene in which an infuriated madman with bloodshot eyes and a foaming mouth played inconceivable havoc with everything inanimate that may be found in a well-appointed dining-room. When he opened the door of his apartment, the fit was over, and his bodily fatigue was so great that he had to catch at the backs of the chairs while crossing the room to reach a low and broad divan on which he let himself fall heavily. His moral prostration was still greater. That brutality of feeling which he had known only when charging the enemy, sabre in hand, amazed this man of 40, who did not recognize in it the instinctive fury of his menaced passion. But in his mental and bodily exhaustion this passion got cleared, distilled, refined into a sentiment of melancholy despair at having perhaps to die before he had taught this beautiful girl to love him. That night General Duel, stretched out on his back with his hands over his eyes, or lying on his breast with his face buried in a cushion, made the full pilgrimage of emotions. Nauseating disgust at the absurdity of the situation, doubt of his own fitness to conduct his existence, and mistrust of his best sentiments, for what the devil did he want to go to Fouche for? He knew them all in turn. "I am an idiot, neither more nor less," he thought, "a sensitive idiot, because I overheard 2 men talking in a cafe. I am an idiot, afraid of lies, whereas in life it is only truth that matters." Several times he got up and, walking in his socks in order not to be heard by anybody downstairs, drank all the water he could find in the dark. And he tasted the torments of jealousy too. She would marry somebody else. His very soul writhed. The tenacity of that Pharaoh, the awful persistence of that imbecile brute came to him with the tremendous force of a relentless destiny. General Duel trembled as he put down the empty water ewer. "He will have me," he thought. General Duel was tasting every emotion that life has to give. He had in his dry mouth the faint, sickly flavour of fear, not the excusable fear before a young girl's candid and amused glance, but the fear of death and the honourable man's fear of cowardice. But if true courage consists in going out to meet an odious danger from which our body, soul and heart recoil together, General Duel had the opportunity to practise it for the first time in his life. He had charged exultingly at batteries and at infantry squares, and ridden with messages through a hail of bullets without thinking anything about it. His business now was to sneak out unheard, at break of day, to an obscure and revolting death. General Duel never hesitated. He carried 2 pistols in a leather bag which he slung over his shoulder. Before he had crossed the garden, his mouth was dry again. He picked 2 oranges. It was only after shutting the gate after him that he felt a slight faintness. He staggered on, disregarding it, and after going a few yards regained the command of his legs. In the colourless and pellucid dawn the wood of pines detached its column of trunks and its dark green canopy very clearly against the rocks of the grey hillside. He kept his eyes fixed on it steadily, and sucked at an orange as he walked. That temperamental, good-humoured coolness in the face of danger, which had made him an officer liked by his men and appreciated by his superiors, was gradually asserting itself. It was like going into battle. Arriving at the edge of the wood, he sat down on a boulder, holding the other orange in his hand, and reproached himself for coming so ridiculously early on the ground. Before very long, however, he heard the swishing of bushes, footsteps on the hard ground, and the sounds of a disjointed, loud conversation. A voice somewhere behind him said boastfully, "He's game for my bag." He thought to himself, "Here they are. What's this about a game? Are they talking about me?" And becoming aware of the other orange in his hand, he thought further, "These are very good oranges, Leonie's own tree. I may just as well eat this orange now instead of flinging it away." Emerging from a wilderness of rock and bushes, General Ferrot and his seconds discovered General Dubert engaged in peeling the orange. They stood still, waiting till he looked up. Then the seconds raised their hats, while General Ferrot, putting his hands behind his back, walked aside a little way. "I am compelled to ask one of you, monsieur, to act for me. I have brought no friends. Will you?" The one-eyed cuirassier said judicially, "That cannot be refused." The other veteran remarked, "It's awkward all the same." "Owing to the state of the people's minds in this part of the country, there was no one I could trust safely with the object of your presence here," explained General Dubert urbanely. They saluted, looked round, and remarked both together, "Poor ground. It's unfit. Why bother about ground measurements and so on? Let us simplify matters. Load the 2 pairs of pistols. I will take those of General Ferrot and let him take mine. Or better still, let us take a mixed pair, one of each pair. Then let us go into the wood and shoot at sight while you remain outside. We did not come here for ceremonies, but for war to the death. Any ground is good enough for that. If I fall, you must leave me where I lie and clear out. It wouldn't be healthy for you to be found hanging about here after that." It appeared, after a short parley, that General Ferrot was willing to accept these conditions. While the seconds were loading the pistols, he could be heard whistling, and was seen to rub his hands with perfect contentment. He flung off his coat briskly, and General Dubert took off his own and folded it carefully on a stone. "Suppose you take your principal to the other side of the wood and let him enter exactly in 10 minutes from now," suggested General Dubert calmly, but feeling as if he were giving directions for his own execution. This, however, was his last moment of weakness. "Wait, let us compare watches first." He pulled out his own. The officer with the chipped nose went over to borrow the watch of General Ferrot. They bent their heads over them for a time. "That's it. At 4 minutes to 6 by yours, 7:02 by mine." It was the cuirassier who remained by the side of General Dubert, keeping his one eye fixed immovably on the white face of the watch he held in the palm of his hand. He opened his mouth, waiting for the beat of the last second, long before he snapped out the word, "Avancez!" General Dubert moved on, passing from the glaring sunshine of the Provençal morning into the cool and aromatic shade of the pines. The ground was clear between the reddish trunks, whose multitude, leaning at slightly different angles, confused his eye at first. It was like going into battle. The commanding quality of confidence in himself woke up in his breast. He was all to his affair. The problem was how to kill the adversary. Nothing short of that would free him from this imbecile nightmare. "There's no use wounding that brute," thought General Dubert. He was known as a resourceful officer. His comrades years ago used also to call him the strategist, and it was a fact that he could think in the presence of the enemy, whereas Ferrot had always been a mere fighter, but a dead shot, unluckily. "I must draw his fire at the greatest possible range," said General Dubert to himself. At that moment he saw something white moving far off between the trees, the shirt of his adversary. He stepped out at once between the trunks, exposing himself freely, then, quick as lightning, leapt back. It had been a risky move, but it succeeded in its object. Almost simultaneously with the pop of a shot, a small piece of bark, chipped off by the bullet, stung his ear painfully. General Ferrot, with one shot expended, was getting cautious. Peeping round the tree, General Dubert could not see him at all. This ignorance of the foe's whereabouts carried with it a sense of insecurity. General Dubert felt himself abominably exposed on his flank and rear. Again something white fluttered in his sight. Ha! The enemy was still on his front, then. He had feared a turning movement, but apparently General Ferrot was not thinking of it. General Dubert saw him pass without special haste from one tree to another in the straight line of approach. With great firmness of mind, General Dubert stayed his hand. Too far yet. He knew he was no marksman. His must be a waiting game, to kill. Wishing to take advantage of the greater thickness of the trunk, he sat down to the ground. Extended at full length, head on to his enemy, he had his person completely protected. Exposing himself would not do now, because the other was too near by this time. A conviction that Ferrau would presently do something rash was like balm to General Duber's soul, but to keep his chin raised off the ground was irksome, and not much use either. He peeped round, exposing a fraction of his head with dread, but really with little risk. His enemy, as a matter of fact, did not expect to see anything of him so far down as that. General Duber caught a fleeting view of General Ferrau shifting trees again with deliberate caution. He despises my shooting, he thought, displaying that insight into the mind of his antagonist which is of such great help in winning battles. He was confirmed in his tactics of immobility. If I could only watch my rear as well as my front, he thought anxiously, longing for the impossible. It required some force of character to lay his pistols down, but on a sudden impulse General Duber did this very gently, one on each side of him. In the army he had been looked upon as a bit of a dandy because he used to shave and put on a clean shirt on the days of battle. As a matter of fact, he had always been very careful of his personal appearance. In a man of nearly 40, in love with a young and charming girl, this praiseworthy self-respect may run to such little weaknesses as, for instance, being provided with an elegant little leather folding case containing a small ivory comb and fitted with a piece of looking-glass on the outside. General Duber, his hands being free, felt in his breeches pocket for that implement of innocent vanity excusable in the possessor of long, silky moustaches. He drew it out, and then, with the utmost coolness and promptitude, turned himself over on his back. In this new attitude, his head a little raised, holding the little looking-glass just clear of his tree, he squinted into it with his left eye, while the right kept a direct watch on the rear of his position. Thus was provided Napoleon's saying that, for a French soldier, the word impossible does not exist. He had the right tree nearly filling the field of his little mirror. If he moves from behind it, he reflected with satisfaction, I am bound to see his legs, but in any case he can't come upon me unawares. And sure enough, he saw the boots of General Ferrau flash in and out, eclipsing for an instant everything else reflected in the little mirror. He shifted his position accordingly, but having to form his judgment of the change from that indirect view, he did not realize that now his feet and a portion of his legs were in plain sight of General Ferrau. General Ferrau had been getting gradually impressed by the amazing cleverness with which his enemy was keeping cover. He had spotted the right tree with bloodthirsty precision. He was absolutely certain of it. And yet he had not been able to glimpse as much as the tip of an ear. As he had been looking for it at the height of about 5 feet 10 inches from the ground, it was no great wonder, but it seemed very wonderful to General Ferrau. The first view of these feet and legs determined a rush of blood to his head. He literally staggered behind his tree and had to steady himself against it with his hand. The other was lying on the ground then, on the ground. Perfectly still, too. Exposed. What could it mean? The notion that he had knocked over his adversary at the first shot entered then General Ferrau's head. Once there, it grew with every second of attentive gazing, overshadowing every other supposition, irresistible, triumphant, ferocious. What an ass I was to think I could have missed him, he muttered to himself. He was exposed en plein, the fool, for quite a couple of seconds. General Ferrau gazed at the motionless limbs, the last vestiges of surprise fading before an unbounded admiration of his own deadly skill with the pistol. Turned up his toes! By the god of war, that was a shot, he exulted mentally. Got it through the head, no doubt, just where I aimed, staggered behind that tree, rolled over on his back and died. And he stared, forgetting to move, almost awed, almost sorry. For nothing in the world would he have had it undone. Such a shot! Rolled over on his back and died. For it was this helpless position, lying on the back, that shouted its direct evidence at General Ferrau. It never occurred to him that it might have been deliberately assumed by a living man. It was inconceivable. It was beyond the range of sane supposition. There was no possibility to guess the reason for it. And it must be said, too, that General Duber's turned-up feet looked thoroughly dead. General Ferrau expanded his lungs for a stentorian shout to his seconds, but, from what he felt to be an excessive scrupulousness, refrained for a while. I will just go and see first whether he breathes yet, he mumbled to himself, leaving carelessly the shelter of his tree. This move was immediately perceived by the resourceful General Duber. He concluded it to be another shift, but when he lost the boots out of the field of the mirror, he became uneasy. General Ferrot had only stepped a little out of the line, but his adversary could not possibly have supposed him walking up with perfect unconcern. General Dubert, beginning to wonder at what had become of the other, was taken unawares so completely that the first warning of danger consisted in the long early morning shadow of his enemy falling aslant on his outstretched legs. He had not even heard a footfall on the soft ground between the trees. It was too much even for his coolness. He jumped up thoughtlessly, leaving the pistols on the ground. The irresistible instinct of an average man, unless totally paralysed by discomfiture, would have been to stoop for his weapons, exposing himself to the risk of being shot down in that position. Instinct, of course, is irreflective. It is its very definition. But it may be an inquiry worth pursuing whether, in reflective mankind, the mechanical promptings of instinct are not affected by the customary mode of thought. In his young days, Armand Dubert, the reflective, promising officer, had emitted the opinion that in warfare one should never cast back on the lines of a mistake. This idea, defended and developed in many discussions, had settled into one of the stock notions of his brain, had become a part of his mental individuality. Whether it had gone so inconceivably deep as to affect the dictates of his instinct, or simply because, as he himself declared afterwards, he was too scared to remember the confounded pistols, the fact is that General Dubert never attempted to stoop for them. Instead of going back on his mistake, he seized the rough trunk with both hands and swung himself behind it with such impetuosity that, going right round in the very flash and report of the pistol shot, he reappeared on the other side of the tree, face to face with General Ferrot. This last, completely unstrung by such a show of agility on the part of a dead man, was trembling yet. A very faint mist of smoke hung before his face, which had an extraordinary aspect, as if the lower jaw had come unhinged. "Not missed!" he croaked hoarsely from the depths of the dry throat. This sinister sound loosened the spell that had fallen on General Dubert's senses. "Yes, missed. À bout portant," he heard himself saying, almost before he had recovered the full command of his faculties. The revulsion of feeling was accompanied by a gust of homicidal fury, resuming in its violence the accumulated resentment of a lifetime. For years General Dubert had been exasperated and humiliated by an atrocious absurdity imposed upon him by this man's savage caprice. Besides, General Dubert had been in this last instance too unwilling to confront death for the reaction of his anguish not to take the shape of a desire to kill. "And I have my 2 shots to fire yet," he added pitilessly. General Ferrot snapped to his teeth, and his face assumed an irate, undaunted expression. "Go on," he said grimly. These would have been his last words if General Dubert had been holding the pistols in his hands. But the pistols were lying on the ground at the floor of a pine. General Dubert had the second of leisure necessary to remember that he had dreaded death not as a man but as a lover, not as a danger but as a rival, not as a foe to life but as an obstacle to marriage. And behold, there was the rival defeated, utterly defeated, crushed, done for. He picked up the weapons mechanically, and instead of firing them into General Ferrot's breast, he gave expression to the thoughts uppermost in his mind. "You will fight no more duels now." His tone of leisurely, ineffable satisfaction was too much for General Ferrot's stoicism. "Don't dawdle then, damn you, for a cold-blooded stuff, coxcomb!" he roared out suddenly, out of an impassive face held erect on a rigidly still body. General Dubert uncocked the pistols carefully. This proceeding was observed with mixed feelings by the other general. "You missed me twice," the victor said coolly, shifting both pistols to one hand. "The last time within a foot or so. By every rule of single combat your life belongs to me. That does not mean that I want to take it now." "I have no use for your forbearance," muttered General Ferrot gloomily. "Allow me to point out that this is no concern of mine," said General Dubert, whose every word was dictated by a consummate delicacy of feeling. In anger he could have killed that man, but in cold blood he recoiled from humiliating by a show of generosity this unreasonable being, a fellow soldier of the Grande Armée, a companion in the wonders and terrors of the great military epic. "You don't set up the pretension of dictating to me what I am to do with what's my own." General Ferrot looked startled, and the other continued. "You've forced me on a point of honour to keep my life at your disposal, as it were, for 15 years. Very well. Now that the matter is decided to my advantage, I am going to do what I like with your life on the same principle. You shall keep it at my disposal as long as I choose, neither more nor less. You are on your honour till I say the word." "I am, but sacre bleu, this is an absurd position for a general of the Empire to be placed in," cried General Ferrau, in accents of profound and dismayed conviction. "It amounts to sitting all the rest of my life with a loaded pistol in a drawer, waiting for your word. It's idiotic. I shall be an object of derision." "Absurd? Idiotic? Do you think so?" queried General Dubert with sly gravity. "Perhaps, but I don't see how that can be helped. However, I am not likely to talk at large of this adventure. Nobody need ever know anything about it, just as no one to this day, I believe, knows the origins of our quarrel. Not a word more," he added hastily. "I can't really discuss this question with a man who, as far as I am concerned, does not exist." When the two duellists came out into the open, General Ferrau walking a little behind, and rather with the air of walking in a trance, the two seconds hurried towards them, each from his station at the edge of the wood. General Dubert addressed them, speaking loud and distinctly. "Messieurs, I make it a point of declaring to you solemnly, in the presence of General Ferrau, that our difference is at last settled for good. You may inform all the world of that fact." "A reconciliation, after all!" they exclaimed together. "Reconciliation? Not that exactly. It is something much more binding. Is it not so, General?" General Ferrau only lowered his head in sign of assent. The two veterans looked at each other. Later in the day, when they found themselves alone out of their moody friend's earshot, the cuirassier remarked suddenly, "Generally speaking, I can see with my one eye as far as most people, but this beats me. He won't say anything." "In this affair of honour, I understand there has been from first to last always something that no one in the army could quite make out," declared the chasseur with an imperfect nose. "In mystery it began, in mystery it went on, in mystery it is to end, apparently." General Dubert walked home with long, hasty strides, by no means uplifted by the sense of triumph. He had conquered, yet it did not seem to him that he had gained very much by his conquest. The night before he had grudged the risk of his life, which appeared to him magnificent, worthy of preservation as an opportunity to win a girl's love. He had known moments when, by a marvellous illusion, this love seemed to be already his, and his threatened life a still more magnificent opportunity of devotion. Now that his life was safe, it had suddenly lost its special magnificence. It had acquired instead a specially alarming aspect as a snare for the exposure of unworthiness. As to the marvellous illusion of conquered love that had visited him for a moment in the agitated watches of the night, which might have been his last on earth, he comprehended now its true nature. It had been merely a paroxysm of delirious conceit. Thus, to this man, sobered by the vicious issue of a duel, life appeared robbed of its charm, simply because it was no longer menaced. Approaching the house from the back, through the orchard and the kitchen garden, he could not notice the agitation which reigned in front. He never met a single soul. Only while walking softly along the corridor he became aware that the house was awake and more noisy than usual. Names of servants were being called out down below in a confused noise of coming and going. With some concern he noticed that the door of his own room stood ajar, though the shutters had not been opened yet. He had hoped that his early excursion would have passed unperceived. He expected to find some servant just gone in, but the sunshine, filtering through the usual cracks, enabled him to see, lying on the low divan, something bulky, which had the appearance of two women clasped in each other's arms. Tearful and desolate murmurs issued mysteriously from that appearance. General Dubert pulled open the nearest pair of shutters violently. One of the women then jumped up. It was his sister. She stood for a moment with her hair hanging down and her arms raised straight up above her head, and then flung herself with a stifled cry into his arms. He returned her embrace, trying at the same time to disengage himself from it. The other woman had not risen. She seemed, on the contrary, to cling closer to the divan, hiding her face in the cushions. Her hair was also loose. It was admirably fair. General Dubert recognized it with staggering emotion. Mademoiselle de Valmassigue, Adele, in distress. He became greatly alarmed and got rid of his sister's hug, definitely. Madame Leone then extended her shapely bare arm out of her peignoir, pointing dramatically at the divan. "This poor terrified child has rushed here from home, on foot, 2 miles, running all the way." "What on earth has happened?" asked General Dubert in a low, agitated voice. But Madame Leone was speaking loudly. "She rang the great bell at the gate and roused all the household. We were all asleep yet. You may imagine what a terrible shock. Adele, my dear child, sit up." General Dubert's expression was not that of a man who imagines with facility. He did, however, fish out of the chaos of surmises the notion that his prospective mother-in-law had died suddenly, but only to dismiss it at once. He could not conceive the nature of the event or the catastrophe which would induce Mademoiselle de Balmacig, living in a house full of servants, to bring the news over the fields herself, 2 miles, running all the way. "But why are you in this room?" he whispered, full of awe. "Of course I ran up to see, and this child, I did not notice it. She followed me. It's that absurd chevalier," went on Madame Leone, looking towards the divan. "Her hair has all come down. You may imagine she did not stop to call her maid to dress it before she started. Adele, my dear, sit up. He blurted it all out to her at 5:30 in the morning. She woke up early and opened her shutters to breathe the fresh air, and saw him sitting collapsed on a garden bench at the end of the great alley. At that hour, you may imagine. And the evening before he had declared himself indisposed. She hurried on some clothes and flew down to him. One would be anxious for less. He loves her, but not very intelligently. He had been up all night, fully dressed, the poor old man, perfectly exhausted. He wasn't in a state to invent a plausible story. What a confidant you chose there! My husband was furious. He said, 'We can't interfere now.' So we sat down to wait. It was awful. And this poor child running with her hair loose over here, publicly. She's been seen by some people in the fields. She has roused the whole household too. It's awkward for her. Luckily you are to be married next week. Adele, sit up. He has come home on his own legs. We expected to see you coming on a stretcher, perhaps. What do I know? Go and see if the carriage is ready. I must take this child home at once. It isn't proper for her to stay here a minute longer." General Dubert did not move. It was as though he had heard nothing. Madame Leone changed her mind. "I will go and see myself," she cried. "I want also my cloak. Adele," she began, but did not add, "sit up." She went out, saying in a very loud and cheerful tone, "I leave the door open." General Dubert made a movement towards the divan, but then Adele sat up, and that checked him dead. He thought, "I haven't washed this morning. I must look like an old tramp. There's earth on the back of my coat and pine needles in my hair." It occurred to him that the situation required a good deal of circumspection on his part. "I am greatly concerned, mademoiselle," he began vaguely, and abandoned that line. She was sitting up on the divan with her cheeks unusually pink and her hair brilliantly fair falling all over her shoulders, which was a very novel sight to the general. He walked away up the room, and looking out of the window for safety, he said, "I fear you must think I behaved like a madman," in accents of sincere despair. Then he spun round and noticed that she had followed him with her eyes. They were not cast down on meeting his glance, and the expression on her face was novel to him also. It was, one might have said, reversed. Those eyes looked at him with grave thoughtfulness, while the exquisite lines of her mouth seemed to suggest a restrained smile. This change made her transcendental beauty much less mysterious, much more accessible to a man's comprehension. An amazing ease of mind came to the general, and even some ease of manner. He walked down the room with as much pleasurable excitement as he would have found in walking up to a battery, vomiting death, fire, and smoke, then stood looking down with smiling eyes at the girl whose marriage with him next week had been so carefully arranged by the wise, the good, the admirable Leone. "Ah, mademoiselle," he said in a tone of courtly regret, "if only I could be certain that you did not come here this morning, 2 miles, running all the way, merely from affection for your mother." He waited for an answer, imperturbable, but inwardly elated. It came in a demure murmur, eyelashes lowered with fascinating effect. "You must not be méchant as well as mad." And then General Dubert made an aggressive movement towards the divan which nothing could check. That piece of furniture was not exactly in the line of the open door, but Madame Leone, coming back wrapped up in a light cloak and carrying a lace shawl on her arm for Adele to hide her incriminating hair under, had a swift impression of her brother's getting up from his knees. "Come along, my dear child," she cried from the doorway. The general, now himself again in the fullest sense, showed the readiness of a resourceful cavalry officer and the peremptoriness of a leader of men. "You don't expect her to walk to the carriage," he said indignantly. "She isn't fit. I shall carry her downstairs." This he did, slowly, followed by his awed and respectful sister. But he rushed back like a whirlwind to wash off all the signs of the night of anguish and the morning of war, and to put on the festive garments of a conqueror before hurrying over to the other house. Had it not been for that, General Dubert felt capable of mounting a horse and pursuing his late adversary in order simply to embrace him from excess of happiness. "I owe it all to this stupid brute," he thought. "He has made plain in a morning what might have taken me years to find out, for I am a timid fool, no self-confidence whatever, perfect coward. And the Chevalier, delightful old man." General Dubert longed to embrace him also. The Chevalier was in bed. For several days he was very unwell. The men of the Empire and the post-revolution young ladies were too much for him. He got up the day before the wedding, and, being curious by nature, took his niece aside for a quiet talk. He advised her to find out from her husband the true story of the affair of honour, whose claim, so imperative and so persistent, had led her to within an ace of tragedy. It is right that his wife should be told, and next month or so will be your time to learn from him anything you want to know, my dear child. Later on, when the married couple came on a visit to the mother of the bride, Madame la Générale Dubert communicated to her beloved old uncle the true story she had obtained without any difficulty from her husband. The Chevalier listened with deep attention to the end, took a pinch of snuff, flicked the grains of tobacco from the frilled front of his shirt, and asked calmly, "And that's all it was over?" "Yes, uncle," replied Madame la Générale, opening her pretty eyes very wide. "Isn't it funny? C'est insensé, to think what men are capable of." Commented the old émigré. "It depends what sort of men. That Bonaparte's soldiers were savages. It is insensé. As a wife, my dear, you must believe implicitly what your husband says." But to Leonie's husband the Chevalier confided his true opinion. "If that's the tale the fellow made up for his wife, and during the honeymoon too, you may depend on it that no one will ever know now the secret of this affair." Considerably later still, General Dubert judged the time come and the opportunity propitious to write a letter to General Ferrot. This letter began by disclaiming all animosity. "I have never," wrote the General Baron Dubert, "wished for your death during all the time of our deplorable quarrel. Allow me," he continued, "to give you back in all form your forfeited life. It is proper that we two, who have been partners in so much military glory, should be friendly to each other publicly." The same letter contained also an item of domestic information. It was in reference to this last that General Ferrot answered from a little village on the banks of the Garonne in the following words: "If one of your boys' names had been Napoleon, or Joseph, or even Joachim, I could congratulate you on the event with a better heart. As you have thought proper to give him the name of Charles-Henri Armand, I am confirmed in my conviction that you never loved the Emperor. The thought of that sublime hero chained to a rock in the middle of a savage ocean makes life of so little value that I would receive with positive joy your instructions to blow my brains out. From suicide I consider myself in honour debarred, but I keep a loaded pistol in my drawer." Madame la Générale Dubert lifted up her hands in despair after perusing that answer. "You see, he won't be reconciled," said her husband. "He must never by any chance be allowed to guess where the money comes from. It wouldn't do. He couldn't bear it." "You are a brave homme, Armand," said Madame la Générale appreciatively. "My dear, I had the right to blow his brains out, but as I didn't, we can't let him starve. He has lost his pension, and he is utterly incapable of doing anything in the world for himself. We must take care of him, secretly, to the end of his days. Don't I owe him the most ecstatic moment of my life? Ha, 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 ha! Over the fields, 2 miles, running all the way. I couldn't believe my ears. But for his stupid ferocity it would have taken me years to find you out. It's extraordinary how in one way or another this man has managed to fasten himself on my deeper feelings. End of The Duel. Il Conde, in a Set of Six, by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Dann. Il Conde. The first time we got into conversation was in the National Museum in Naples, in the rooms on the ground floor containing the famous collection of bronzes from Herculaneum and Pompeii, that marvellous legacy of antique art whose delicate perfection has been preserved for us by the catastrophic fury of a volcano. He addressed me first over the celebrated resting Hermes which we had been looking at side by side. He said the right things about that wholly admirable piece, nothing profound. His taste was natural rather than cultivated. He had obviously seen many fine things in his life and appreciated them, but he had no jargon of a dilettante or the connoisseur, a hateful tribe. He spoke like a fairly intelligent man of the world, a perfectly unaffected gentleman. We had known each other by sight for some few days past. Staying in the same hotel, good but not extravagantly up to date, I had noticed him in the vestibule going in and out. I judged he was an old and valued client. The bow of the hotel keeper was cordial in its deference, and he acknowledged it with familiar courtesy. For the servants he was Il Conde. There was some squabble over a man's parasol, yellow silk with white lining sort of thing, the waiters had discovered abandoned outside the dining-room door. Our gold-laced doorkeeper recognized it, and I heard him directing one of the lift boys to run after Il Conde with it. Perhaps he was the only count staying in the hotel, or perhaps he had the distinction of being the count par excellence, conferred upon him because of his tried fidelity to the house. Having conversed at the Museo, and by the by he had expressed his dislike of the busts and statues of Roman emperors in the gallery of marbles, their faces were too vigorous, too pronounced for him. Having conversed already in the morning, I did not think I was intruding when, in the evening, finding the dining-room very full, I proposed to share his little table. Judging by the quiet urbanity of his consent, he did not think so either. His smile was very attractive. He dined in an evening waistcoat and a smoking, he called it so, with a black tie. All this a very good cut, not new, just as these things should be. He was, morning or evening, very correct in his dress. I have no doubt that his whole existence had been correct, well ordered and conventional, undisturbed by startling events. His white hair, brushed upwards off a lofty forehead, gave him the air of an idealist, of an imaginative man. His white moustache, heavy but carefully trimmed and arranged, was not unpleasantly tinted, a golden yellow in the middle. The faint scent of some very good perfume and of good cigars, that last an odour quite remarkable to come upon in Italy, reached me across the table. It was in his eyes that his age showed most. They were a little weary, with creased eyelids. He must have been 60 or a couple of years more, and he was communicative. I would not go so far as to call it garrulous, but distinctly communicative. He had tried various climates, of Abbazzia, of the Riviera, of other places too, he told me, but the only one which suited him was the climate of the Gulf of Naples. The ancient Romans, who, he pointed out to me, were men expert in the art of living, knew very well what they were doing when they built their villas on these shores, in Baiae, in Vico, in Capri. They came down to this seaside in search of health, bringing with them their trains of mimes and flute players to amuse their leisure. He thought it extremely probable that the Romans of the higher classes were specially predisposed to painful rheumatic affections. This was the only personal opinion I heard him express. It was based on no special erudition. He knew no more of the Romans than an average informed man of the world is expected to know. He argued from personal experience. He had suffered himself from a painful and dangerous rheumatic affection till he found relief in this particular spot of southern Europe. This was 3 years ago, and ever since he had taken up his quarters on the shores of the Gulf, either in one of the hotels in Sorrento or hiring a small villa in Capri. He had a piano, a few books, picked up transient acquaintances of a day, a week, or a month in the stream of travellers from all Europe. One can imagine him going out for his walks in the streets and lanes, becoming known to beggars, shopkeepers, children, country people, talking amiably over the walls to the contadini, and coming back to his rooms or his villa to sit before the piano with his white hair brushed up and his thick orderly moustache to make a little music for myself. And of course, for a change, there was Naples nearby. Life, movement, animation, opera. A little amusement, as he said, is necessary for health. Mimes and flute players, in fact. Only, unlike the magnates of ancient Rome, he had no affairs of the city to call him away from these moderate delights. He had no affairs at all. Probably he had never had any grave affairs to attend to in his life. It was a kindly existence, with its joys and sorrows regulated by the course of nature, marriages, births, deaths, ruled by the prescribed usages of good society and protected by the state. He was a widower, but in the months of July and August he ventured to cross the Alps for 6 weeks on a visit to his married daughter. He told me her name. It was that of a very aristocratic family. She had a castle in Bohemia, I think. This is as near as I ever came to ascertaining his nationality. His own name, strangely enough, he never mentioned. Perhaps he thought I had seen it on the published list. Truth to say, I never looked. At any rate, he was a good European. He spoke 4 languages to my certain knowledge, and a man of fortune. Not of great fortune, evidently, and appropriately. I imagine that to be extremely rich would have appeared to him improper, outre, too blatant altogether. And obviously, too, the fortune was not of his making. The making of a fortune cannot be achieved without some roughness. It is a matter of temperament. His nature was too kindly for strife. In the course of conversation he mentioned his estate quite by the way in reference to that painful and alarming rheumatic affection. One year, staying incautiously beyond the Alps as late as the middle of September, he had been laid up for 3 months in that lonely country house with no one but his valet and the caretaking couple to attend to him. Because, as he expressed it, he kept no establishment there. He had only gone for a couple of days to confer with his land agent. He promised himself never to be so imprudent in the future. The first weeks of September would find him on the shores of his beloved Gulf. Sometimes in travelling one comes upon such lonely men whose only business is to wait for the unavoidable. Deaths and marriages have made a solitude round them, and one really cannot blame their endeavours to make the waiting as easy as possible. As he remarked to me, "At my time of life, freedom from physical pain is a very important matter." It must not be imagined that he was a wearisome hypochondriac. He was really much too well bred to be a nuisance. He had an eye for the small weaknesses of humanity, but it was a good-natured eye. He made a restful, easy, pleasant companion for the hours between dinner and bedtime. We spent 3 evenings together, and then I had to leave Naples in a hurry to look after a friend who had fallen seriously ill in Taormina. Having nothing to do, Il Conde came to see me off at the station. I was somewhat upset, and his idleness was always ready to take a kindly form. He was by no means an indolent man. He went along the train, peering into the carriages for a good seat for me, and then remained talking cheerily from below. He declared he would miss me that evening very much, and announced his intention of going after dinner to listen to the band in the public garden, the Villa Nazionale. He would amuse himself by hearing excellent music and looking at the best society. There would be a lot of people, as usual. I seem to see him yet, his raised face with a friendly smile under the thick moustaches, and his kind, fatigued eyes. As the train began to move, he addressed me in 2 languages, first in French, saying "Bon voyage," and then in his very good, somewhat emphatic English, encouragingly, because he could see my concern, "All will be well yet." My friend's illness having taken a decidedly favourable turn, I returned to Naples on the 10th day. I cannot say I had given much thought to Il Conde during my absence, but entering the dining-room I looked for him in his habitual place. I had an idea he might have gone back to Sorrento, to his piano and his books and his fishing. He was a great friend with all the boatmen, and fished a good deal with lines from a boat. But I made out his white head in the crowd of heads, and even from a distance noticed something unusual in his attitude. Instead of sitting erect, gazing all round with alert urbanity, he drooped over his plate. I stood opposite him for some time before he looked up, a little wildly, if such a strong word can be used in connection with his correct appearance. "Ah, my dear sir, is it you?" he greeted me. "I hope all is well." He was very nice about my friend. Indeed, he was always nice, with the niceness of people whose hearts are genuinely humane. But this time it cost him an effort. His attempts at general conversation broke down into dullness. It occurred to me he might have been indisposed, but before I could frame the inquiry, he muttered, "You find me here very sad." "I am sorry for that," I said. "You haven't had bad news, I hope?" It was very kind of me to take an interest. No, it was not that. Not bad news, thank God. And he became very still, as if holding his breath. Then, leaning forward a little, and in an odd tone of awed embarrassment, he took me into his confidence. "The truth is that I have had a very, how shall I say, abominable adventure happen to me." The energy of the epithet was sufficiently startling in that man of moderate feelings and toned-down vocabulary. The word unpleasant I should have thought would have fitted amply the worst experience likely to befall a man of his stamp. And an adventure, too, incredible. But it is in human nature to believe the worst, and I confess I eyed him stealthily, wondering what he had been up to. In a moment, however, my unworthy suspicions vanished. There was a fundamental refinement of nature about the man, which made me dismiss all idea of some more or less disreputable scrape. "It is very serious, he went on nervously. "I will tell you after dinner, if you will allow me." I expressed my perfect acquiescence by a little bow, nothing more. I wished him to understand that I was not likely to hold him to that offer if he thought better of it later on. We talked of indifferent things, but with a sense of difficulty quite unlike our former easy, gossipy intercourse. The hand raising a piece of bread to his lips, I noticed, trembled slightly. This symptom in regard to my reading of the man was no less than startling. In the smoking room he did not hang back at all. Directly we had taken our usual seats, he leaned sideways over the arm of his chair and looked straight into my eyes earnestly. "You remember," he began, "that day you went away. I told you then I would go to the Villa Nazionale to hear some music in the evening." I remembered. His handsome old face, so fresh for his age, unmarked by any trying experience, appeared haggard for an instant. It was like the passing of a shadow. Returning his steadfast gaze, I took a sip of my black coffee. He was systematically minute in his narrative, simply in order, I think, not to let his excitement get the better of him. After leaving the railway station, he had an ice and read the paper in a cafe. Then he went back to the hotel, dressed for dinner, and dined with a good appetite. After dinner he lingered in the hall. There were chairs and tables there, smoking his cigar, talked to the little girl of the primo tenore of the San Carlo Theatre, and exchanged a few words with that amiable lady, the wife of the primo tenore. There was no performance that evening, and these people were going to the villa also. They went out of the hotel. Very well. At the moment of following their example, it was 9:30 already, he remembered he had a rather large sum of money in his pocket-book. He entered, therefore, the office, and deposited the greater part of it with the bookkeeper of the hotel. This done, he took a carrozzella and drove to the seashore. He got out of the cab and entered the villa on foot from the Lago di Vittoria end. He stared at me very hard, and I understood then how really impressionable he was. Every small fact and event of that evening stood out in his memory as if endowed with mystic significance. If he did not mention to me the colour of the pony which drove the carrozzella and the appearance of the man who drove, it was a mere oversight arising from his agitation, which he repressed manfully. He had then entered the Villa Nazionale from the Lago di Vittoria end. The Villa Nazionale is a public pleasure ground laid out in grass plots, bushes and flower beds between the houses of the Riviera di Chioggia and the waters of the bay. Alleys of trees, more or less parallel, stretch its whole length, which is considerable. On the Riviera di Chioggia side, the electric tram-cars run close to the railings. Between the garden and the sea is the fashionable drive, a broad road bordered by a low wall, beyond which the Mediterranean splashes with gentle murmurs when the weather is fine. As life goes on late at night in Naples, the broad drive was all astir with a brilliant swarm of carriage lamps moving in pairs, some creeping slowly, others running rapidly under the thin, motionless line of electric lamps defining the shore. And a brilliant swarm of stars hung above the land, humming with voices, piled up with houses, glittering with lights, and over the silent flat shadows of the sea. The gardens themselves are not very well lit. Our friend went forward in the warm gloom, his eyes fixed upon a distant, luminous region extending nearly across the whole width of the villa, as if the air had glowed there with its own cold, bluish and dazzling light. This magic spot behind the black trunks of trees and masses of inky foliage breathed out sweet sounds mingled with bursts of brassy roar, sudden clashes of metal, and grave, vibrating thuds. As he walked on, all these noises combined together into a piece of elaborate music, whose harmonious phrases came persuasively through a great disorderly murmur of voices and shuffling of feet on the gravel of that open space. An enormous crowd, immersed in the electric light, as if in the bath of some radiant and tenuous fluid shed upon their heads by luminous globes, drifted in its hundreds round the band. Hundreds more sat on chairs in more or less concentric circles, receiving unflinchingly the great waves of sonority that ebbed out into the darkness. The Count penetrated the throng, drifted with it in tranquil enjoyment, listening and looking at the faces. All people of good society, mothers with their daughters, parents and children, young men and young women, all talking, smiling, nodding to each other. Very many pretty faces and very many pretty toilettes. There was, of course, a quantity of diverse types, showy old fellows with white moustaches, fat men, thin men, officers in uniform, but what predominated, he told me, was the southern Italian type of young man with a colourless, clear complexion, red lips, jet-black little moustache, and liquid black eyes so wonderfully effective in leering or scowling. Withdrawing from the throng, the Count shared a little table in front of the cafe with a young man of just such a type. Our friend had some lemonade. The young man was sitting moodily before an empty glass. He looked up once and then looked down again. He also tilted his hat forward, like this. The Count made the gesture of a man pulling his hat down over his brow, and went on. "I think to myself, he is sad. Something is wrong with him. Young men have their troubles. I take no notice of him, of course. I pay for my lemonade and go away." Strolling about in the neighbourhood of the band, the Count thinks he saw twice that young man wandering alone in the crowd. Once their eyes met. It must have been the same young man, but there were so many there of that type that he could not be certain. Moreover, he was not very much concerned, except in so far that he had been struck by the marked, peevish discontent of that face. Presently, tired of the feeling of confinement one experiences in a crowd, the Count edged away from the band. An alley, very sombre by contrast, presented itself invitingly with its promise of solitude and coolness. He entered it, walking slowly on till the sound of the orchestra became distinctly deadened. Then he walked back and turned about once more. He did this several times before he noticed that there was somebody occupying one of the benches. The spot being midway between two lamp-posts, the light was faint. The man lolled back in the corner of the seat, his legs stretched out, his arms folded, and his head drooping on his breast. He never stirred, as though he had fallen asleep there, but when the Count passed by next time he had changed his attitude. He sat leaning forward. His elbows were propped on his knees, and his hands were rolling a cigarette. He never looked up from that occupation. The Count continued his stroll away from the band. He returned slowly, he said. I can imagine him enjoying to the full, but with his usual tranquillity, the balminess of this southern night and the sounds of music softened delightfully by the distance. Presently he approached for the third time the man on the garden seat, still leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It was a dejected pose. In the semi-obscurity of the alley, his high shirt collar and his cuffs made small patches of vivid whiteness. The Count said that he had noticed him getting up brusquely as if to walk away, but almost before he was aware of it, the man stood before him, asking in a low, gentle tone whether the signore would have the kindness to oblige him with a light. The Count answered this request by a polite "Certainly," and dropped his hands with the intention of exploring both pockets of his trousers for the matches. "I dropped my hands," he said, "but I never put them in my pockets. I felt a pressure there." He put the tip of his finger on the spot close under his breastbone, the very spot of the human body where a Japanese gentleman begins the operation of the harakiri, which is a form of suicide following upon dishonour, upon an intolerable outrage to the delicacy of one's feelings. "I glanced down," the Count continued, in an awestruck voice, "and what do I see? A knife, a long knife." "You don't mean to say," I exclaimed, amazed, "that you have been held up like this in the villa at 10:30, within a stone's throw of 1,000 people?" He nodded several times, staring at me with all his might. "The clarionet," he declared solemnly, "was finishing his solo, and I assure you I could hear every note. Then the band crashed fortissimo, and that creature rolled its eyes and gnashed its teeth, hissing at me with the greatest ferocity, 'Be silent! No noise!' or—" I could not get over my astonishment. "What sort of knife was it?" I asked stupidly. "A long blade, a stiletto, perhaps a kitchen knife. A long, narrow blade. It gleamed. And his eyes gleamed, his white teeth too. I could see them. He was very ferocious. I thought to myself, if I hit him he will kill me. How could I fight with him? He had the knife and I had nothing. I am nearly 70, you know, and that was a young man. I seemed even to recognize him, the moody young man of the cafe, the young man I met in the crowd. But I could not tell. There are so many like him in this country." The distress of that moment was reflected in his face. I should think that, physically, he must have been paralyzed by surprise. His thoughts, however, remained extremely active. They ranged over every alarming possibility. The idea of setting up a vigorous shouting for help occurred to him too, but he did nothing of the kind, and the reason why he refrained gave me a good opinion of his mental self-possession. He saw in a flash that nothing prevented the other from shouting too. That young man might in an instant have thrown away his knife and pretended I was the aggressor. Why not? He might have said I attacked him. Why not? It was one incredible story against another. He might have said anything, bring some dishonouring charge against me. What do I know? By his dress he was no common robber. He seemed to belong to the better classes. What could I say? He was an Italian. I am a foreigner. Of course I have my passport, and there is our consul, but to be arrested, dragged at night to the police office like a criminal— He shuddered. It was in his character to shrink from scandal much more than from mere death. And certainly for many people this would have always remained, considering certain peculiarities of Neapolitan manners, a deucedly queer story. The Count was no fool. His belief in the respectable placidity of life having received this rude shock, he thought that now anything might happen. But also a notion came into his head that this young man was perhaps merely an infuriated lunatic. This was, for me, the first hint of his attitude towards this adventure. In his exaggerated delicacy of sentiment, he felt that nobody's self-esteem need be affected by what a madman may choose to do to one. It became apparent, however, that the Count was to be denied that consolation. He enlarged upon the abominably savage way in which that young man rolled his glistening eyes and gnashed his white teeth. The band was going now through a slow movement of solemn braying by all the trombones, with deliberately repeated bangs of the big drum. "But what did you do?" I asked, greatly excited. "Nothing," answered the Count. "I let my hands hang down very still. I told him quietly I did not intend making a noise. He snarled like a dog, then said in an ordinary voice, 'Vostro portafolio.' So I naturally," continued the Count, and from this point acted the whole thing in pantomime. Holding me with his eyes, he went through all the motions of reaching inside his inside breast pocket, taking out a pocket-book and handing it over. But that young man, still bearing steadily on the knife, refused to touch it. He directed the Count to take the money out himself, received it into his left hand, motioned the pocket-book to be returned to the pocket, all this being done to the sweet trilling of flutes and clarionets sustained by the emotional drone of the hautboys. And the young man, as the Count called him, said, "This seems very little." It was indeed only 340 or 360 lire, the Count pursued. I had left my money in the hotel, as you know. I told him this was all I had on me. He shook his head impatiently and said, "Vostro orologio." The Count gave me the dumb show of pulling out his watch, detaching it. But, as it happened, the valuable gold half-chronometer he possessed had been left at the watchmaker's for cleaning. He wore that evening, on a leather guard, the Waterbury 50-franc thing he used to take with him on his fishing expeditions. Perceiving the nature of this booty, the well-dressed robber made a contemptuous clicking sound with his tongue like this, and waved it away hastily. Then, as the Count was returning the disdained object to his pocket, he demanded with a threateningly increased pressure of the knife on the epigastrium, by way of reminder, "Vostri anelli." One of the rings, went on the Count, was given me many years ago by my wife. The other is the signet ring of my father. I said, "No, that you shall not have." Here the Count reproduced the gesture corresponding to that declaration by clapping one hand upon the other and pressing both thus against his chest. It was touching in its resignation. "That you shall not have," he repeated firmly, and closed his eyes, fully expecting, I don't know whether I am right in recording that such an unpleasant word had passed his lips, fully expecting to feel himself being, I really hesitate to say, being disembowelled by the push of the long, sharp blade resting murderously against the pit of his stomach, the very seat in all human beings of anguishing sensations. Great waves of harmony went on flowing from the band. Suddenly the Count felt the nightmarish pressure removed from the sensitive spot. He opened his eyes. He was alone. He had heard nothing. It is probable that the young man had departed with light steps some time before, but the sense of the horrid pressure had lingered even after the knife had gone. A feeling of weakness came over him. He had just time to stagger to the garden seat. He felt as though he had held his breath for a long time. He sat all in a heap, panting with the shock of the reaction. The band was executing with immense bravura the complicated finale. It sounded with a tremendous crash. He heard it, unreal and remote, as if his ears had been stopped, and then the hard clapping of 1,000 more or less pairs of hands, like a sudden hail-shower passing away. The profound silence which succeeded recalled him to himself. A tram-car resembling a long glass box wherein people sat with their heads strongly lighted ran along swiftly within 60 yards of the spot where he had been robbed. Then another rustled by, and yet another going the other way. The audience about the band had broken up, and were entering the alley in small conversing groups. The Count sat up straight and tried to think calmly of what had happened to him. The vileness of it took his breath away again. As far as I can make out, he was disgusted with himself. I do not mean to say with his behaviour. Indeed, if his pantomimic rendering of it for my information was to be trusted, it was simply perfect. No, it was not that. He was not ashamed. He was shocked at being the selected victim, not of robbery so much as of contempt. His tranquillity had been wantonly desecrated. His lifelong kindly nicety of outlook had been defaced. Nevertheless, at that stage, before the iron had time to sink deep, he was able to argue himself into comparative equanimity. As his agitation calmed down somewhat, he became aware that he was frightfully hungry. Yes, hungry. The sheer emotion had made him simply ravenous. He left the seat, and after walking for some time, found himself outside the gardens and before an arrested tram-car, without knowing very well how he came there. He got in as if in a dream, by a sort of instinct. Fortunately, he found in his trouser pocket a copper to satisfy the conductor. Then the car stopped, and as everybody was getting out, he got out too. He recognized the Piazza San Ferdinando, but apparently it did not occur to him to take a cab and drive to the hotel. He remained in distress on the piazza like a lost dog, thinking vaguely of the best way of getting something to eat at once. Suddenly he remembered his 20-franc piece. He explained to me that he had had that piece of French gold for something like 3 years. He used to carry it about with him as a sort of reserve in case of accident. Anybody is liable to have his pocket picked, a quite different thing from a brazen and insulting robbery. The monumental arch of the Galleria Umberto faced him at the top of a noble flight of stairs. He climbed these without loss of time and directed his steps towards the Café Umberto. All the tables outside were occupied by a lot of people who were drinking. But as he wanted something to eat, he went inside into the café, which is divided into aisles by square pillars set all round with long looking-glasses. The Count sat down on a red plush bench against one of these pillars, waiting for his risotto, and his mind reverted to his abominable adventure. He thought of the moody, well-dressed young man with whom he had exchanged glances in the crowd around the bandstand, and who, he felt confident, was the robber. Would he recognize him again? Doubtless. But he did not want ever to see him again. The best thing was to forget this humiliating episode. The Count looked round anxiously for the coming of his risotto, and behold, to the left against the wall, there sat the young man. He was alone at a table, with a bottle of some sort of wine or syrup and a carafe of iced water before him. The smooth olive cheeks, the red lips, the little jet-black moustache turned up gallantly, the fine black eyes a little heavy and shaded by long eyelashes, that peculiar expression of cruel discontent to be seen only in the busts of some Roman emperors. It was he, no doubt at all. But that was a type. The Count looked away hastily. The young officer over there reading a paper was like that too, same type. Two young men farther away playing draughts also resembled. The Count lowered his head with a fear in his heart of being everlastingly haunted by the vision of that young man. He began to eat his risotto. Presently he heard the young man on his left call the waiter in a bad-tempered tone. At the call, not only his own waiter, but two other idle waiters belonging to a quite different row of tables rushed towards him with obsequious alacrity, which is not the general characteristic of the waiters in the Café Umberto. The young man muttered something, and one of the waiters, walking rapidly to the nearest door, called out into the Galleria, "Pasquale! Oh, Pasquale!" Everybody knows Pasquale, the shabby old fellow who, shuffling between the tables, offers for sale cigars, cigarettes, picture postcards, and matches to the clients of the café. He is, in many respects, an engaging scoundrel. The Count saw the grey-haired, unshaven ruffian enter the café, the glass case hanging from his neck by a leather strap, and, at a word from the waiter, make his shuffling way with a sudden spurt to the young man's table. The young man was in need of a cigar, with which Pasquale served him fawningly. The old pedlar was going out when the Count, on a sudden impulse, beckoned to him. Pasquale approached, the smile of deferential recognition combining oddly with the cynical, searching expression of his eyes. Leaning his case on the table, he lifted the glass lid without a word. The Count took a box of cigarettes, and, urged by a fearful curiosity, asked as casually as he could, "Tell me, Pasquale, who is that young signore sitting over there?" The other bent over his box confidentially. "That Signore Conde," he said, beginning to rearrange his wares busily and without looking up. "That is a young cavaliere of a very good family from Bari. He studies in the university here, and is the chief, capo, of an association of young men, a very nice young men." He paused, and then, with mingled discretion and pride of knowledge, murmured the explanatory word "Camorra," and shut down the lid. "A very powerful Camorra," he breathed out. "The professors themselves respect it greatly. Una lira in 50 centesimi, Signor Conde." Our friend paid with the gold piece. While Pasquale was making up the change, he observed that the young man, of whom he had heard so much in a few words, was watching the transaction covertly. After the old vagabond had withdrawn with a bow, the Count settled with the waiter and sat still. A numbness, he told me, had come over him. The young man paid too, got up and crossed over, apparently for the purpose of looking at himself in the mirror set in the pillar nearest to the Count's seat. He was dressed all in black, with a dark green bow tie. The Count looked round, and was startled by meeting a vicious glance out of the corners of the other's eyes. The young cavaliere from Bari, according to Pasquale, but Pasquale is, of course, an accomplished liar, went on arranging his tie, settling his hat before the glass, and meantime he spoke just loud enough to be heard by the Count. He spoke through his teeth with the most insulting venom of contempt, and gazing straight into the mirror. "Ah, so you had some gold on you, you old liar, you old braba, you furfante. But you are not done with me yet." The fiendishness of his expression vanished like lightning, and he lounged out of the café with a moody, impassive face. The poor Count, after telling me this last episode, fell back trembling in his chair. His forehead broke into perspiration. There was a wanton insolence in the spirit of this outrage which appalled even me. What it was to the Count's delicacy I won't attempt to guess. I am sure that if he had been not too refined to do such a blatantly vulgar thing as dying from apoplexy in a cafe, he would have had a fatal stroke there and then. All irony apart, my difficulty was to keep him from seeing the full extent of my commiseration. He shrank from every excessive sentiment, and my commiseration was practically unbounded. It did not surprise me to hear that he had been in bed a week. He had got up to make his arrangements for leaving southern Italy for good and all. And the man was convinced that he could not live through a whole year in any other climate. No argument of mine had any effect. It was not timidity, though he did say to me once, "You do not know what a Camorra is, my dear sir. I am a marked man." He was not afraid of what could be done to him. His delicate conception of his dignity was defiled by a degrading experience. He couldn't stand that. No Japanese gentleman, outraged in his exaggerated sense of honour, could have gone about his preparations for hara-kiri with greater resolution. To go home really amounted to suicide for the poor Count. There is a saying of Neapolitan patriotism, intended for the information of foreigners, I presume, "See Naples and then die. Vedi Napoli e poi muori." It is a saying of excessive vanity, and everything excessive was abhorrent to the nice moderation of the poor Count. Yet, as I was seeing him off at the railway station, I thought he was behaving with singular fidelity to its conceited spirit. Vedi Napoli. He had seen it. He had seen it with startling thoroughness, and now he was going to his grave. He was going to it by the train de luxe of the International Sleeping Car Company via Trieste and Vienna. As the 4 long, sombre coaches pulled out of the station, I raised my hat with the solemn feeling of paying the last tribute of respect to a funeral cortege. Il Conde's profile, much aged already, glided away from me in stony immobility behind the lighted pane of glass. Vedi Napoli e poi muori. End of Il Conde. End of A Set of Six by Joseph Conrad.